Rabelais, the foil is naturally Michel de Montaigne, and here's a complete collection of essays. Now, they're quite an eclectic bunch. Montaigne existing in the second half of the 16th century as a foil to Rabelais, who we discussed in the previous part, being in the first half. Where Rabelais has disjointed lunacy, the eclecticness of this, though, doesn't betray an otherwise calm serenity to how Montaigne takes you through his separate topics. Sainte-Beuve, the 19th century French critic, called Montaigne the wisest of all Frenchmen. And it was in these ages between 1533 and 92 that he gained his experience of a soul with a large repertoire for classical knowledge upon which he could console himself. And in his musings, sit back in his vineyard retreat and shut the door to the turmoil of France to a certain degree and get to have his escapism through the classics. He was as well travelled as Rabelais, but he was better read. Came from the wine-owning estate de Vequem and had been granted classical training by his father, sympathetic to Michel's own love of all things antiquity. So his father gave him this German schoolmaster who would talk to him only in Latin. And so from a young age, we already see Montaigne is very much in the mold of teacher being taught. And even in his essays here, there is a great pedagogical undertone to much of his essays. Some are specifically written to show how students should learn certain texts and how they should be taught. Whereas compare that to Rabelais, who could never fit in anywhere and would definitely not find comfort in that schoolmaster and student dialectic. So he was sent to the College of Guyenne, and which was at the time one of the finest in France due to the tutors it had there. He thrived in leading roles in the Latin tragedies of Buchanan and Mouret. And his essays are actually penned later in life, hence their more mature tone. So after 1571, he had the retirement from public life and took to his writing on his vineyard, as we've outlined. He inherited his father's estate and became a businessman by day, and by evening would pen his reflections onto paper. His style was of the essay, so it's not in the classical form. This isn't like Milton trying to capture some sort of epic poem or any of those, Tasso, any of those epic poetries. He goes for the essay, so it's not like trying to be a replica of Virgil's Aeneid, for instance, Ronsard making the Frankiad. This is not what Montaigne is trying to do. Nevertheless, you cannot but constantly see his great knowledge of the classics. As a young boy, he devoured the Metamorphoses, as well as the works of Plutarch and Seneca. Weigh heavily on him, using the highly influential translations of Jacques Amiot, who I highlighted in the translations chapter. We can also see at this time maybe a few more names that we should get familiar with in twinning the Renaissance, Reformation style writers with those from antiquity, considering the knowledge of Montaigne is so vast. Cicero, we've already said, should have been brought in prior to this. But as well as Cicero and the Virgils and the big hitters, let's start thinking about Lucretius, let's start thinking about Catullus, and let's start thinking about Lucan. We should know all of these at this point, because that's where Montaigne's knowledge was. He was also quite strong on the Greek philosophers. Plato, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and even some Xenophon. Let's look at the three ways in which Montaigne then used his essays. So one, we already said, was in a pedagogical sense, but that's actually not how Hyatt categorizes them. He says the first one for Hyatt is as philosophical doctrine, right? A penchant for finding the true and the valuable in sort of apothegms of old. In this way, he's following on from Erasmus from the first half of the century. The second is as treasuries of illustrations. He's obtained this great readership, this widely read brain, vast knowledge of antiquity. And he's trying to simply give allusions or illustrations of certain things by being able to pick out examples from antiquity. So after he'd laid down his truth, the classics were sources of illustrations, providing this truth. See his use of Alexander the Great, Plautus, and Martial in his Essays 155, which is ostensibly on smells and odours, yet he brings in all these tales from antiquity into it. And then finally, the third classification Hayat gives of his essays is as a well-compacted argument, right? So there were no modern philosophers to put so much thinking into a concentrated place. Only the classics, the great span of the entire civilizations of Greece and Rome, and then carefully collected and cultivated in a mind like that of Montaigne, could aid an argument and give something coherent and concrete into the turmoil that was in France at the time. So then we're left with the question, was he the inventor of the modern essay? Ultimately, Hayat says perhaps, but that does not seem to be what he had in mind. He was writing short-form moral treatises on themes such as cruelty, glory, anger, etc., mirror the topics pondered by a Seneca and a Plutarch some 1500 years earlier. And we've already said, in his mind, what he was really trying to do in terms of a more contemporary writer was to mimic the adages of Erasmus. Because his collection was of such a wide expanse, you are left with some strange off topics which then lose that coherent structure that we were talking about earlier and spin off into things such as on odor, such as on the custom of wearing clothes, or on 3 good wives, for instance. Rabelais had hinted at, as well, the autobiographical elements to Gargantua, but here Michel de Montaigne does not hide away from the fact that this is entirely him. And parts of Montaigne's voice can be seen as the emergence of the I in the beginning of Renaissance thought, where the individual is placed at a point of primacy with regard to devouring texts or to place a thought forward that we hadn't seen before. Sometimes you do see Montaigne lumped in to that group. And as such, we've discussed on this channel elsewhere that Montaigne was seen by Emerson to be the archetypical skeptic, or someone who believed only in his own interpretations of things and would pick holes at many of the other parts. And that's what he did, using these essays as a vehicle of such. So he can be seen as someone who began moral and intellectual freedom, but can also be seen to have brought in maybe some of the more destructive elements of the skeptic. And really, when I think about where he stands in the trajectory of French literature, and you'll see this in some of the later ones on Baroque, by the time we enter the court of Louis XIV with Racine and with the Molière, we're much more contained as a literary form. Montaigne springs up in the incoherence where there's no fixed way, there's no fixed court, there's no fixed literary vehicle to send yourself through. And that's really why he emerges as this skeptic, as this individual intellectual thinker, rather than one who fits in with categorization of others. That this would have been impossible to have done later in the 17th century. It's only in this late 16th century France that someone such as Montaigne can emerge as such a figure.